I have always believed that food is a story. My perfect tomato soup, for instance, tells a story of patience and warmth. My ex-husband Arthur never cared for that story. He just opened a monument to himself in glass and marble, serving dishes that scream of ego. He has no idea that the most powerful storyteller in the city's food scene is the woman he erased, and I am about to write his final chapter. The rain had been tapping a gentle rhythm against my window panes all afternoon, a soft percussion to the quiet work of my life. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of things that took their time: slow-roasted tomatoes, a whisper of garlic, and the clean, green scent of fresh basil. I held the ceramic bowl in my hands, its gentle heat seeping into my palms. It was a good warmth, an honest warmth. My spoon, a simple silver one worn smooth from years of use, broke the surface of the soup. The color was a deep, reassuring red, the kind of red that doesn't come from a can. I brought it to my lips and tasted. It was exactly as it should be. The tomatoes were sweet, with just enough acidity to make my tongue tingle. The basil was a bright counterpoint, and the slow-simmered garlic and onion provided a foundation of pure comfort. It was a simple soup. It was a perfect soup. It was the kind of food that understood a rainy Tuesday in October. I set the bowl down on the polished surface of my antique oak desk. To its left sat a single, perfect white orchid in a small celadon vase. To its right, my laptop glowed, the half-written death sentence of another restaurant blinking on the screen. The subject of my critique was a place called Aperture, a sterile white box of a restaurant where the main course was served on a bed of ethereal vapor. My main course had been a single, tortured scallop perched atop a dollop of parsnip foam and drizzled with a conceptual reduction of something I think was, once upon a time, a blackberry. It had all the emotional resonance of a spreadsheet. I took another spoonful of my soup, letting its simple truth wash the memory of that foam away. Then my fingers found the keyboard. The gentle tick-tack-tick of the keys was the only sound in the room besides the rain. At Aperture, I typed, the chefs are not cooks. They are architects of disappointment. They build towering structures of technique on foundations of sheer disregard for the diner. We are not there to be fed, you see. We are there to bear witness to their genius. The problem is, genius is not a flavor. I paused, rereading the lines. A small smile touched my lips. For 3 decades, I had been the Gilded Spoon, a phantom, a whisper in the ears of the city's most celebrated and most terrified chefs. They imagined me as a man, most likely, someone severe and academic, with a cruel little twist to his mouth. They would never picture a 72-year-old woman in a comfortable cashmere sweater, eating tomato soup in her quiet apartment overlooking the park. They would never picture Beatrice Hayes. The invisibility was the point. It was my shield, and it was my sword. Take the seared diver scallop, I continued, the words flowing easily. It arrived looking less like food and more like a hostage situation. The parsnip foam, a substance with the texture of forgotten laundry soap, did little to rescue the lonely mollusk from its plight. One expects a dish that costs $64 to offer something in return, joy perhaps, or at the very least, a pleasant memory. This offered only a question: why? I finished the last of my soup, the final spoonful as satisfying as the first. I wiped my lips with a linen napkin, the fabric soft against my skin. The review was nearly done. It was fair, it was witty, and it would be utterly devastating. I had built a career on the simple belief that food should be, above all else, an act of generosity. A dish that exists only to show off its creator's cleverness is the opposite of generous. It is an act of profound selfishness. I had learned that lesson a long, long time ago, in a kitchen very different from this one. With a final paragraph that compared the restaurant's soullessness to a beautifully composed but empty photograph, I finished the review. I read it over one last time, made a few small edits, and attached it to a draft in my secure encrypted email account. My editor, A young man named David, who had never once heard my voice, would have it posted by morning. Aperture would be the talk of the town for all the wrong reasons. I closed the laptop, the satisfying click echoing in the quiet room. My work was done. I carried my empty bowl to the kitchen, rinsed it, and placed it gently in the dishwasher. The rain was letting up, the tapping on the window softening to a murmur. It was time to settle in with a good book. Just as I turned off the kitchen light, a soft ping came from my desk, an incoming message. I usually ignored my inbox after filing a review, letting the world digest my words without my supervision. But something made me pause. A feeling, perhaps. The same instinct that tells a cook when a sauce is about to break. I walked back to my desk and lifted the screen of the laptop. It was a press release, forwarded by David. The subject line consisted of 3 words. 3 words that made the warmth from the soup instantly vanish from my body, leaving a sudden, sharp chill in its place. L'amour propre, opening gala. For a long moment, I just stared at the 3 words on the screen. L'amour propre, self-esteem, or, more accurately, self-love. A pricklier, more defensive kind of love, the kind that needs to be constantly proven, polished, and put on display. It was so perfectly him that a dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Of course, what else would Arthur Beaumont call his monument to himself? My hand, feeling strangely disconnected from my body, moved the cursor and clicked open the email. The press release was a masterpiece of pretentious prose. It bloomed on the screen in a crisp sans-serif font, accompanied by a professionally shot photograph. It was a picture of Arthur. He was older, of course, 75 now. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but they weren't the laugh lines of a joyful man. They were the etched marks of scrutiny and judgment. His hair was a perfect silvery helmet, and he wore a dark suit so exquisitely tailored it looked like a coat of armor. He stood with one hand resting on the back of a velvet dining chair, his expression one of immense, profound seriousness. As if he weren't opening a restaurant, but solving world hunger, I forced myself to read the text. This autumn, culinary visionary Arthur Beaumont invites you on an unparalleled gastronomic journey. L'amour propre is not merely a restaurant. It is a philosophy rendered in flavor, a testament to the belief that dining is the highest form of art. For decades, Mr. Beaumont has been a titan of industry, but his first and most enduring passion has always been the elevation of the palate. A titan of industry. He'd sold imported bathroom fixtures. Very expensive bathroom fixtures, to be sure, but bathroom fixtures all the same. I read on, my stomach tightening into a cold, hard knot. The release spoke of ingredient-driven narratives, curated taste memories, and a symphony of sensory engagement. It was a word salad of the highest order, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. The restaurant was located in the old Merchants Bank building downtown, a place of soaring marble columns and cold, echoing floors. A temple for his ego. The document ended with a quote from Arthur himself. "We are creating an experience that transcends mere food. We are crafting emotion. L'amour propre will be a validation for those who understand that true excellence requires sacrifice." I knew all too well whose sacrifice he was talking about. I could almost feel the phantom weight of a heavy cast-iron pan in my hand. Could almost smell the simple, fragrant beef stew I had been so proud of, the one he scraped into the bin with a look of weary disgust 30 years ago. "My God, Beatrice," he'd said, his voice quiet but dripping with a condescension that could strip paint. "It's so brown." That was the beginning of the end. My cooking, he'd decided, was an anchor holding back his ascent into a more rarefied world. My peasant food, as he later called it, was a reflection of my own simple, unsophisticated soul, a soul that could no longer be his running mate in the marathon of social climbing. My breath hitched. The scent of my own honest soup seemed to be retreating from the room, chased away by the ghost of his pretentious prose. The desk felt cold beneath my forearms. A second ping from the laptop cut through the silence. It was another email from David, my editor. This one wasn't a forward. The subject was simply, "Tonight." My eyes scanned the short message. "Spoon just saw you filed the Aperture review. Brilliant, as always. But this Beaumont thing, this is the one. I've had 3 calls from the Times already, wanting to know if you're going to cover it. The hype is off the charts. Everyone is calling it the most important opening in a decade. This can't be one of my staff writers. It can't be a freelancer. It has to be you. We need the first review. The definitive review. I'll handle the booking. Just tell me when. But it needs to happen opening week. David," I read the email twice. The words swam before my eyes. It has to be you. He had no idea what he was asking. To him, this was just a story, the biggest culinary scoop of the year. A chance for the Gilded Spoon to once again prove its dominance, its unerring eye for truth. He couldn't know that he was asking me to walk back into the coldest room of my life, to sit down at the table of the man who had hollowed me out and remade me. I closed my eyes, picturing Arthur's face in the photograph, smug, self-satisfied, and utterly certain of his own genius. He had forgotten me. I was sure of it. To him, I was just a ghost, a first wife, a footnote in the grand story of his ascent. An anecdote about feelings and brown food, a wave of something cold and sharp washed over me. It wasn't just anger. It was a terrible, clarifying sense of purpose. He had built his temple of self-love on the foundations of my supposed failure. He had written a story about me, about us, and had been telling it to himself and others for 30 years. And now, my editor was handing me a pen. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, the glugging sound unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. I didn't add ice. I wanted the uncomplicated, smoky burn of it. With the glass in one hand and my phone in the other, I walked into the living room and sank into my favorite armchair, the one upholstered in deep blue velvet that faced the park. The rain had passed, and the streetlights below cast a shimmering, fractured glow on the wet leaves of the oak trees. On a small table beside me, a silver frame held a photograph of a sun-drenched market in Marrakesh, a wonderful, chaotic riot of color from a trip I took the first year I was alone. My thumb hovered over Carol's name in my contacts list. For 40 years she had been my anchor. She was the one who sat with me on my kitchen floor the night Arthur left, letting me weep into a dish towel until there was nothing left. She was also the one who, a year later, handed me a passport and a plane ticket and told me to get the hell out of town and remember who I was. She was the only living soul who knew that Beatrice Hayes and the Gilded Spoon were the same person. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring. "Don't tell me," she said, her voice a familiar welcome crackle in my ear. "Aperture already sent you a fruit basket and a groveling apology." "Worse," I said. My own voice sounded thin. "He's back, Carol." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Carol didn't need a surname. "He?" she finally asked, her tone shifting from breezy to razor sharp. "You mean the Lord of the Manor?" "Mr. Bathroom Fixtures himself. He's opening a restaurant, a big one. The biggest of the year." I took a sip of bourbon. The fiery liquid traced a slow path down to the knot in my stomach. "It's called l'amour propre." A loud, unladylike snort erupted from the phone. "Oh, that is rich. That is richer than his third wife's trust fund." "You're kidding me." "I wish I were." "And David, my editor, he's insisting. He says the Gilded Spoon has to be the one to review it." "Well, of course he is." "My God, Bea, do you not see the poetry? The universe spent 30 years writing this joke, and you're the punchline." "I can't do it," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "I won't, it's too much. I'm over it. I'm past it. What is there to prove?" I stared at the photo of the Moroccan market, a place so full of life and spice and genuine, uncomplicated joy. That was my life now, not the cold marble and icy judgment of Arthur's world. "Oh, over it?" Carol's voice was dangerously gentle. "Honey, you're the one who still goes ramrod straight whenever you see a man in a navy blue blazer. You're the one who refuses to cook beef stew, ever. You're not over it. You just built a beautiful, soundproofed room around it." And he just knocked on the door. "It's not about revenge," I insisted, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. The condensation felt cold against my fingers. The Gilded Spoon is not a tool for my personal vendettas. It's about honesty, integrity. It would be a conflict of interest. Bull, she said, the word sharp and clean. This isn't about a vendetta. This is about justice. He built a career, a marriage, a whole second life on the story that you were a bad cook with no taste. He dined out on that story for years. And now you, the most respected food critic in the city, have been asked, professionally, to go and taste his food. It's not a conflict of interest, Beatrice. It's a goddamn reckoning. I was silent, watching a lone taxi hiss down the wet street below. The clean, sharp smell of the post-rain air drifted in through a crack in the window. Carol softened her tone. Look, what are you afraid of? That he'll recognize you? No, I admitted quietly. I'm afraid he won't. Exactly, she said, pouncing on it. You'll be a ghost at the feast. You, of all people, will be able to see the truth. Is his food actually any good? Or is it just expensive nonsense designed to prop up his fragile ego? The Gilded Spoon's job is to tell the city what is true, and you are the only person on earth who can tell the whole truth about this. I took a deep breath, the bourbon and the ozone-laced air filling my lungs. She was right. Of course she was right. My refusal wasn't about professional integrity. It was about fear. Fear of that old feeling, the quiet shame of being told you are not good enough. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was the woman who had stood alone in the Gemma Elfna Square and eaten a tagine that changed her life. I was the woman who could kill a restaurant with a paragraph. I was the Gilded Spoon. My shoulders, which had been hunched up around my ears, slowly relaxed. I straightened my back against the velvet of the armchair. What if the food is amazing? I asked, the question a final test. Then you write that it's amazing, Carol said simply. You write that the soulless bastard, after 30 years of practice, finally learned how to cook. And then you move on for real. But I'd bet my pension it's pretentious garbage. A real smile, the first one of the evening, finally found my lips. You always did know how to make an entrance. It's my specialty. Now stop talking to me. You have an email to write. Book it for Friday. Give him a few days to bask in his own glory before you bring the hammer down. I haven't decided yet. Yes, you have, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Talk to you Saturday. She hung up. I sat there for another minute, the dial tone buzzing softly in my ear. I finished my bourbon, placed the empty glass on the table next to the silver frame, and walked back to my desk. The laptop was still open, David's email glowing patiently. My fingers felt steady as I typed my reply. David, you're right. It has to be me. Please book a table for one for this Friday at 8 p.m. Use the standard pseudonym, Eleanor Vance, Spoon. My cursor hovered over the send button for a single thundering heartbeat. Then with a quiet click it was gone. Friday evening arrived with a crisp autumn chill that felt like a prelude. I chose my armor with care. A simple, charcoal gray cashmere dress, low heels that made almost no sound, and a single strand of pearls. It was the uniform of a wealthy widow, elegant but designed to be overlooked, invisible. My hair was silver, my face was lined, and I carried a small, unassuming clutch. No one would ever suspect I was there to pass judgment. The taxi dropped me off in front of the Old Merchants Bank. Its grand, neoclassical facade was uplit with dramatic cold white lights, making the massive Corinthian columns look like the bones of some long-dead beast. The heavy brass door handles were polished to a mirror shine. As I pulled one open, I felt its profound, unyielding coldness seep into my hand. The inside was a cavern of sound and shadow. The ceiling soared 50 feet into darkness, and the vast space swallowed noise, reducing the conversations of the city's elite to a low, reverent murmur. A colossal crystal chandelier hung in the center of the room like a frozen explosion, its light glittering off everything but warming nothing. The tables, draped in stiff white linen, were scattered across the marble floor like lonely islands in a dark, silent sea. In the center of the floor, I could just make out the faint, worn mosaic of the bank's original seal, a ghost of commerce under the temple of cuisine. A maître d', a young man with a severe haircut and a suit so tight it looked painted on, approached me. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation?" His voice was smooth but held the bored, practiced tone of someone who has already sized you up and found you wanting. "I do," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "A table for one, under Vance. Eleanor Vance." He tapped on a tablet, his eyes flicking over me for a fraction of a second too long. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Vance, right this way." He led me not to one of the better tables along the wall, but to a small, slightly isolated two-top near a service corridor, a table clearly reserved for single diners and other social undesirables. I didn't protest. It was perfect. It gave me a clear view of the entire room. He pulled out the chair with a perfunctory gesture, and I sat, the velvet of the seat cool against my legs. "Your server will be with you shortly," he said. And then he was gone, gliding back toward the entrance to greet a younger, louder, more important couple. I placed my clutch on the table and let my eyes drift across the dining room. It was exactly as I had imagined, a stage. And on that stage, holding court, was Arthur. He wasn't greeting guests at the door. That was beneath him. He was moving between the most important tables, a hand on this man's shoulder, a shared laugh with that woman. He looked magnificent, a silver-haired king in his castle. His laugh, a booming, confident sound I remembered all too well, echoed slightly in the cavernous space. It was the laugh of a man who has never once questioned his own importance. A young woman in a crisp black uniform arrived with a bottle of water, pouring it into my glass with silent, robotic efficiency. She placed a menu, a heavy cardstock folio, in front of me and disappeared. I didn't open it. My focus was on the slow, deliberate path Arthur was tracing around the room. He was getting closer. My heart began a low, heavy thudding against my ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. He was 2 tables away now, speaking with a man I recognized from the city council. Then he turned, his eyes sweeping the room with a proprietary air. His gaze passed right over me, through me, as if I were a piece of furniture. There was not a flicker of recognition, not a hint of curiosity. I was a gray dress, silver hair, a featureless part of the scenery. The woman he had spent 20 years of his life with, the woman who had borne his children, was nothing more than a shadow. He took a step toward my section of the room, heading for a large table of what looked like investors. His path would take him directly past my chair. My hands, resting in my lap, clenched into fists. The linen napkin felt rough beneath my knuckles. This was it. The moment of truth, closer. The scent of his expensive cologne, a sharp citrusy smell I hadn't smelled in 30 years, cut through the sterile air. He was beside me. The fabric of his tailored suit jacket was so close I could see the fine gray threads in the wool. My breathing stopped. I kept my eyes fixed on the water glass in front of me, my reflection a pale, indistinct blur on its curved surface. And then he was past. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't slowed. He hadn't even angled his body away from the table. It was as if I simply wasn't there. The moment I had dreaded, the moment I had played over in my mind 1,000 times, had been a complete non-event. The sting was sharp, a jab of ice water in my veins. The shame of being so thoroughly erased, but then something else rose up behind it. Something cold and clear and powerful. He didn't see me. He couldn't see me, the ghost at the feast. Carol was right. My invisibility was absolute. And in this room, in this temple to his own ego, a ghost with a pen was the most dangerous thing in the world. A server appeared at my elbow, a young man with a nervous smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance. My name is Julian, and I'll be your server tonight. Have you had a moment to look at the menu?" I looked up at him, and for the first time that evening, I smiled a genuine smile. I picked up the heavy cardstock. The mission was no longer daunting. It was simple. I was here to work. "Yes, thank you, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I think I'm ready." I ordered the 5-course tasting menu. It seemed the most efficient way to take the full measure of the place. Julian, my server, nodded with a solemnity better suited to a funeral director. An excellent choice, Mrs. Vance. The first course arrived on a plate so wide and white it seemed to stretch for miles. In the center sat a single oyster. Below it was a translucent gelée made from cucumber and lime. And on top, a perfect sphere of green foam that the server, in a hushed, reverent tone, called an effervescence of green apple. The chef's intention, Julian recited from memory, is to capture the fleeting moment between the sea and the shore. I looked at the lonely oyster. It looked less like it was between the sea and the shore, and more like it had been abducted by aliens. I lifted the tiny fork. The gelée had the texture of soft plastic and tasted faintly of refrigerator. The foam, which smelled of nothing at all, dissolved on my tongue into a puff of cool, vaguely sweet air. The oyster itself was fresh, briny, and of excellent quality. But it was utterly lost, a prisoner in a cage of pointless technique. In the small notebook I'd placed in my lap, I discreetly jotted down a single phrase: an oyster, tragically widowed. The plates were cleared with silent efficiency. The second course was the deconstructed New England clam chowder. I had been morbidly curious about this one. It arrived in a shallow bowl that was more of a liquid retaining sculpture. There was no broth. Instead, there was a smear of potato puree, 3 perfect cubes of salt pork, and a single exquisite little-neck clam, steamed open and sitting forlornly in its shell. The chowder part was a warm, off-white foam that Julian poured from a silver pitcher around the other components. A reimagining of a classic, he explained, his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. We separate the elements to allow each to express its individual truth. I dipped my spoon into the foam. It was lukewarm and had the airy, insubstantial texture of soap suds. It tasted vaguely of cream and salt, but it lacked the fundamental, soul-warming essence of chowder. It was a ghost of a soup. The potato puree was silky smooth, a testament to a very expensive blender, but it was bland. The single clam was, again, of impeccable quality, but it was just a clam. It wasn't part of a family. It was an orphan. I wrote in my notebook, "All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put this chowder together again." I saw Arthur making his rounds again, accepting praise with the practiced humility of a man who believes he is merely getting his due. He seemed to float through the room on a cloud of adoration. Other diners were taking pictures of their food, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. They weren't eating a meal. They were acquiring content. They were consuming an idea, not a dinner. My third course was the rack of lamb. It was presented as 2 perfect rosy pink chops, trimmed with surgical precision. The fat was rendered perfectly, the meat cooked sous vide to an exact medium rare from edge to edge. It was, technically, the most flawless piece of lamb I had ever seen. It was accompanied by a single, perfectly turned carrot and a dark, glossy smear of what Julian called a black garlic reduction. I pressed my fork into the meat. It yielded with almost no resistance, but as I brought the bite to my mouth, I noticed something missing. There was no smell. No savory, roasted, fatty aroma that makes your mouth water. I chewed slowly. The texture was uniform, almost too tender, lacking the satisfying chew of meat that has met a real flame. And the flavor? It was gone. The sous vide process, in its quest for technical perfection, had poached all the life out of it. It was lamb in theory only. The black garlic reduction was intense and sweet, but it was a desperate attempt to add a personality that the main ingredient simply didn't have. My pen scratched across the paper in my lap. This lamb did not die in vain. It died in boredom. I felt a strange sort of clinical detachment. The anger and the fear I'd felt earlier were gone, replaced by a critic's cold clarity. This wasn't personal. This was a professional assessment of a profound failure. Arthur hadn't built a restaurant. He'd built a laboratory. He wasn't a chef. He was a technician. He hadn't elevated food. He had lobotomized it. Julian returned to clear my plate. He saw the mostly uneaten lamb, but his professional veneer didn't crack. He was trained not to notice such things. "I hope you enjoyed the lamb, madam." "It was very precise," I said. "It was the truest thing I could say." He gave a slight, satisfied nod, as if this were the highest compliment. "Excellent. The kitchen will be pleased." He paused, placing his hands behind his back. "And now for your main course. The chef's signature dish." I looked up at him, my pen poised over the notebook. "Tonight," he announced with a gravity that bordered on absurd, "we are proud to present the homage to the hearth." My hands were perfectly still in my lap. The name of the dish echoed in the quiet space between my ears, an irony so profound it was almost elegant. Homage to the hearth. The hearth was my domain, the place he had scorned, the place of warmth and nourishment he had systematically dismantled in our home before moving on to our marriage. Julian returned with the dish, carrying it with the care of a museum curator handling a priceless artifact. He placed it before me, and for a moment I could only stare. It was served in a wide, dark earthenware bowl. But this was no stew. It was an art installation. In the center sat a perfect, glistening cube of short rib, so dark it was almost black. Around it were arranged jewel-like, minuscule root vegetables, pearl onions turned to a glassy translucence, carrots no bigger than my pinky nail, and a single, solitary new potato, hollowed out and filled with a chive-flecked crème fraîche. A silky, impossibly smooth parsnip puree formed a pale swoosh on one side of the bowl. Then came the theater. Julian produced a small glass cloche filled with a swirling gray vapor. "Applewood smoke," he whispered, to evoke the essence of the open fire. He placed it over the bowl for a dramatic 10-second count, then lifted it with a flourish. The smoke billowed out, a fragrant but completely artificial cloud that smelled more like a candle than a cooking fire. It dissipated almost instantly, leaving no trace. "The braising liquid is poured tableside," he continued, holding up a small copper saucepan. He tilted it, and a stream of dark, viscous, intensely concentrated sauce flowed into the bowl, pooling around the beef but never touching the puree. A 72-hour veal-just reduction. He stepped back, his work complete. "Enjoy the homage," he said, and vanished. I looked at the plate. It was beautiful. It was exquisite. It was a lie. My beef stew had been a humble, generous thing. All the ingredients swam together in a rich, thick gravy, the flavors melding over hours into a singular, comforting whole. It was a community in a bowl. This thing in front of me was a collection of isolated, beautiful hermits. My fork sank into the cube of beef. It flaked apart with no effort. The meat, braised for what must have been days, was impossibly tender. I took a bite. The flavor was immense, a deep, concentrated wave of umami from the veal juice. It was overpowering. It was the flavor of technique, of time and reduction and process. It was not the flavor of beef. I tasted a carrot. It was sweet and perfectly cooked. I tasted the puree. It was as smooth as silk and tasted faintly of parsnip. Each component was perfect, and none of them belonged together. As I brought a second bite to my lips, the taste, the smell, the sheer calculated artistry of it all triggered something deep inside me. The marble dining room dissolved. Suddenly I was 30 years younger, standing in my old yellow kitchen. The air smelled rich and wonderful, a homey perfume of beef and thyme and red wine. A pot of stew, my best stew, was simmering on the stove. Arthur walked in, wearing the suit he'd just bought for a big client dinner. He sniffed the air, and his face, which had been bright with ambition, clouded over. He lifted the lid from the pot. "What is this, Beatrice?" "It's beef stew," I said, my voice bright. "Your favorite." He stared down into the bubbling, hearty depths of the pot. "It's so brown," he said, the words I would never forget. He picked up the heavy pot with 2 oven mitts, walked to the back door, and scraped the entire contents into the metal bin we kept for scraps. The sound it made, a wet, ugly thump and scrape, was the sound of my heart breaking. "The Somervilles are coming to dinner next week," he'd said, not looking at me. "We'll need to serve something cleaner." The memory faded, leaving me back in the cold, quiet restaurant, a fork halfway to my mouth. A single hot tear I hadn't realized was coming escaped and slid down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly with my knuckle. And then I understood. It was never about my cooking. It was never about the food at all. He didn't think my stew was bad. He thought it was common. He thought it was beneath him. It represented a simple, unpretentious world he was desperate to escape. That brown, hearty, life-giving meal was everything his new curated self was supposed to transcend. This dish in front of me, this wasn't an homage to the hearth. This was his terrified, frantic rebuttal to it. This was him spending a fortune and 72 hours of cooking time to scream to the world, "I'm not that simple man. I am not from that simple place. I am complex and sophisticated and worthy of this marble palace." This wasn't food. It was a defense mechanism on a plate. The knot of old pain in my stomach didn't tighten. It dissolved. It simply washed away, replaced by a profound, almost pitying clarity. He hadn't rejected me all those years ago. He had rejected himself. And he was still doing it, night after night, with every tortured, soulless plate he sent out of his kitchen. My mission, I realized, was no longer about a 30-year-old wound. It was no longer his story or my story. It was about the food. It was about defending the honest, life-giving truth of a simple meal against this kind of beautiful, expensive, and deeply pathetic lie. I took one more deliberate, analytical bite, then placed my fork and knife together on the plate. I was finished. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room. I found him near the bar, accepting a glass of champagne, basking in the glow of his success. And for the first time I saw him clearly, not as my ex-husband, not as a monster, but as the subject of my next review. I waved Julian over and declined dessert. The thought of another course, another meticulously constructed tower of sugar and air, was unbearable. My palate and my spirit were exhausted. "Just an espresso, please," I told him. "Very strong." He nodded and returned a few moments later with a small, white ceramic cup containing a thimbleful of dark, viscous coffee. The rich, bitter aroma was a welcome dose of reality in the otherwise sterile air. I held the cup in both hands, letting its heat seep into my fingers, a small, solid point of warmth in the vast, cold room. The clarity I'd felt after the homage had settled into a kind of calm, professional focus. The review was already taking shape in my head, its structure and tone assembling themselves piece by piece. It would be honest. It would be incisive. It would be, I thought, the fairest thing I had ever written. That's when Arthur moved to the table next to mine. It was a plush, semicircular banquette, occupied by a woman whose diamonds seemed to generate their own gravitational field. She was rail-thin, with a face pulled tight from surgery and a laugh like ice cubes clinking in a glass. I recognized her from society pages, a real estate heiress named Blythe or Brooke or something equally crisp and expensive. Arthur slid into the banquette beside her, his movements smooth and proprietary. A waiter materialized instantly, refilling their champagne flutes. Arthur's back was partially to me, but in the acoustics of that cavernous room, his voice carried. He was performing, his tone pitched for both his companion and anyone else of importance who might be listening. "The response has been overwhelming." "Darling," he was saying, his voice a low, self-satisfied purr. "The Times called it a triumph of vision. We were booked solid for 3 months before we even opened the doors." "Oh, it's divine, Arthur," the woman, Blythe, chimed in. The sound of her bracelets clinking together was like a tiny, frantic alarm. "That lamb was a work of art. I don't know how you do it. My chef at home is an absolute troglodyte. Everything is just roasted." She said the word roasted as if it were a communicable disease. Arthur chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of condescending agreement. "Ah, yes, the rustic imperative. It's a constant battle. True culinary art is about elevation, about escaping the mundane. It's about control, discipline. He took a delicate sip of his champagne. I took a sip of my espresso. The coffee was strong and bitter on my tongue. I kept my eyes on my cup, a quiet, gray-haired woman listening to the city hum, utterly invisible. "You have such a passion for it," Blythe said, her voice breathy with admiration. "It's not just a business for you, is it?" "Passion is the engine, of course," Arthur said, leaning in conspiratorially. His voice dropped, but I could still hear every word perfectly. "But passion without intellect is just sentimentality. It's messy." He paused for effect. "My first wife, bless her heart, could never understand that." A cold prickle, sharp and sudden, went down my spine. I did not move. I did not breathe. Blythe let out a little tinkle of a laugh. "The one from before." "Constance?" "Beatrice," he corrected, the name sounding alien in his mouth. "And she was a lovely woman in her way. But she cooked with feelings." He said the word with such a delicate, dismissive sneer that it felt like a physical blow. Can you imagine? She believed a dish's value was in its ability to, I don't know, comfort someone. It was all peasant food, really. Hearty, sentimental, and utterly devoid of ambition. He sat back, taking another sip of champagne, the story complete, the judgment rendered. It took me years to unlearn that kind of thinking, to understand that the goal isn't to comfort, but to challenge, to awe. The pity I had felt earlier vanished in a flash of white heat. The calm, professional clarity was instantly honed to a razor's edge. He hadn't changed, not one bit. 30 years, a new wife, a new life, a new empire of porcelain and brass. And he was still the same insecure man, building his own worth by demolishing mine. He was still telling the same story to anyone who would listen, the tired, pathetic fable of the sophisticated man held back by his simple, sentimental wife. He needed that story. Without it, the foundation of his marble temple would crack. I had my title. I had my angle. And now I had my ending. He had handed it to me himself, a final, perfect, damning quote. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my espresso cup back on its saucer. It made a soft, definitive chink. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and laid it on the table. It was more than enough. I didn't want to wait for the change. I didn't want to spend another second in that room. Without a backward glance, I stood up, my chair making no sound on the thick rug. I walked away from the table, past the banquette where Arthur was still holding court, past the maitre d' who barely registered my departure. I pushed open the heavy brass door and stepped out into the cool, clean night air. The investigation was over. The evidence was all in. It was time to go home and write. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my oak desk, a single lamp cutting a warm circle of light in the darkness, and I wrote. The words didn't flow. They poured out of me, a torrent of 30 years of suppressed truth, now filtered through the cool, precise lens of the Gilded Spoon. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the sharp clatter of the keys the only sound in the sleeping city. I titled the review, Self-Esteem is a Dish Best Served Warm. I began not with the food, but with the name. L'Amour Propre is a restaurant that tells you everything you need to know about it before you ever taste a bite. It is a declaration of self-love, but the meal it serves is a profound act of self-deception. It is the loneliest restaurant in the city, a cavern of exquisite technique where nothing and no one ever truly connects. I wrote about the oyster, the chowder, the lamb. I praised the flawless technique, the surgical precision, the immense budget that was evident on every plate. And then I dismantled each one, piece by piece, for its profound lack of generosity. For the final section, I wrote about the homage to the hearth. The signature dish is a masterpiece of reduction, a 72-hour process that successfully strips a humble beef stew of everything that makes it wonderful. Its warmth, its fellowship, its soul. It is a dish cooked not with feeling, but with a terrible, crippling fear of it. It is a monument to an ego so fragile it must encase itself in foams, gels, and smoke, lest a simple, honest flavor reveal the emptiness within. I hit send at 4 in the morning. The review went live at 9. By 10, my phone was vibrating with a fury I had never seen. It buzzed against the polished wood of my desk, a relentless, angry insect. News alerts, social media tags, a dozen missed calls from a blocked number I knew was Arthur's. The review didn't just land. It detonated. It was the only thing the city was talking about. By afternoon, I read that L'Amour Propre had received over 500 cancellations. By evening, a financial news site was reporting that 2 of Arthur's primary investors were re-evaluating their position. Weeks passed. The noise faded. I read, with a kind of clinical distance, that the restaurant was temporarily closing for a menu overhaul. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. On a bright, cool Saturday in late October, I was at the farmer's market downtown, my favorite place in the world. The air smelled of damp earth, crisp apples, and roasting coffee. I was on the phone with Carol, a canvas bag heavy with winter squash and kale looped over my arm. Heard from a friend of a friend that he's blaming the staff. The critics, the city, the weather, Carol was saying, her voice crackling with amusement. Everyone but the man in the mirror. It was never about me, Carol, I said, pausing to admire a pyramid of glossy red peppers. I touched one. The skin was cool and smooth. I see that now. The review was just a diagnosis. Well, Dr. B, the patient is terminal, she laughed. Are you happy? I thought for a moment, watching a little girl take a big bite of a Honeycrisp apple, her face a perfect picture of uncomplicated joy. Happy isn't the right word, I said. I feel balanced. The books are settled. I had a meeting with David that afternoon, a rare face-to-face to sign my new contract. As I was leaving the publisher's glass and steel headquarters, my contract safely in my clutch, I saw him. Arthur. He was storming out of the lobby, his face a mask of mottled red fury. His perfect silver hair was disheveled, his suit jacket rumpled. He was shouting at a young man I recognized as David's assistant. You tell your phantom critic, you tell that cowardly hack, that they didn't review a restaurant, they executed a man. He bellowed, his voice echoing in the sterile lobby. I instinctively shrank back into the shadow of a large concrete pillar. He pushed past the assistant and shoved his way through the revolving doors. He was moving so fast, so blindly, that as he burst onto the sidewalk, he stumbled right into me. The corner of his shoulder brushed my arm. "Watch where you're going," he snarled, not even looking at me. He looked right through me, his eyes wild with rage, seeing nothing but an obstacle, a gray, anonymous woman in his path. For a single heartbeat, we were inches apart. I could see the tiny broken blood vessels on his cheeks, the frantic desperation in his eyes. The man who had haunted my life for 3 decades, and he had no idea who I was. He stormed off toward the street, trying to hail a cab. I stood there on the pavement, the cool city air on my face. The faint, sad scent of his expensive cologne hung in the air for a second, then was gone. No anger rose in me, no triumphant glee, only a quiet, final wave of pity. A taxi pulled up to the curb in front of me, its light on. The driver smiled. I opened the door. Just before I ducked inside, I glanced back at Arthur. He was still standing on the curb, a diminished king stranded in the ruins of his own kingdom, waving his arms at a city that was no longer paying attention. I gave him one last, small, knowing smile that he would never see. Then I got into the cab, closed the door with a soft, solid click, and let the city carry me home.